This week in Pure Reinvention.
The way that optimism began to percolate is there was an idea of attracting the Super Bowl to Detroit. And, after the giggles died down and we set about that, that was a real turning point, a real we can moment.
Episode 141, Mark Denson, Director, Detroit Economic Growth Corporation.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Anita, Mark has done a tremendous job at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. He's made a tremendous difference there. What are some of the takeaways our listeners should be kind of cued into?
People need to focus on how he expresses the importance of the history and the can-do place and the ability to extract where his focal point went to make sure that he was successful.
What is it about history that is compelling? Because a lot of times people want to live in the history. So why is history important to understand?
History is important to understand in that story is if the leader doesn't truly understand that and have a good concept, they're really unable to put down a foundation and a path for that continued success and that change.
So you're using the history as an example to say, here's where we've been and appreciate and respect it, which gives you your launch pad for making new history.
Absolutely. It assists to make sure you don't make the same mistakes that occurred in the past.
Can-do attitude is almost everything, isn't it?
Yes.
I would guess you would tell me if you had to pick just one thing in the world that you could take with you, it would be the can-do attitude, because with that, you can do anything.
Believing. The can-do attitude is actually believing and having that eternal hope.
Why is that so important in the story of the reinvention of Detroit?
Because Mark was able to get people to believe in his vision and to dig out that hope that had not been with Detroit for a long period of time. And it's a very daunting task, but he really was able to extract the hope of the people and get them to believe in his can-do place.
With that can-do attitude, almost anything's possible.
It is.
Let's listen.
Starters, that really does speak to me as a young person.
It's kind of like being in boot camp with 12 other people that you've never met before.
I've really gotten to know and appreciate the diverse people in our group.
This has just been an absolutely phenomenal experience. I've learned a ton about myself and realized that there are a lot of people that have a very similar journey to me.
Pure Reinvention is happy to announce our second Starters Consort, October 4th and 5th, and October 24th and 25th. Go to purereinvention.com/starters and start your reinvention journey today. We're here today with Mark Denson, Director of Business Development for the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. Mark, thank you so much for spending a few minutes with Pure Reinvention.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
We really want to get a little bit more curious about you. And so we want to ask you kind of the three questions we ask everybody at the intro. And that is, number one, of the 5 steps in the reinvention process, which step do you most closely associate yourself with?
Connect.
What is your superpower?
It can't be connect.
Well, it might be a really good connector. And then the third one, and this is always kind of the interesting one of, can you describe a situation most recently where you found yourself in an uncomfortable situation?
I was in a meeting with someone who was, let's say, very important, and I had to give them some bad news. And this is a person who is not accustomed to being told no. And I went into this situation with a group of people who we agreed on a strategy to address the situation. And everybody took a step back.
Except you.
Yes, I was the one who had to stand up and say no and why. And there was no support. And it was pretty awful.
Mark, tell us a little bit about your specific role at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. What is it you do?
My role at the DEGC, the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, is to bring new investment into the city by attracting major corporate investors to Detroit. I manage a team of 5 people, and I handle all of our investments into greater downtown.
So, and you've been doing that for how long?
At the DGC, almost 8 years, but I've been in economic development almost 30.
Okay, so you've seen Detroit through a lot of different phases.
This is true.
And since our theme for this month for reinvention in our podcast is simplification, can you describe what you think one of the really major awareness were in the city began to suggest we could not do business the same way as we were?
I think one of the things that happened the year of the 3 mayors, 2008, 2009, 2010, it was pretty clear we had a mayor resign in disgrace. and we had a series of people come in and out of the office, and people began to despair. And it was clear we had to do something unique to turn the city around. Our problems were great, and in that, we needed great and creative solutions to make the city move forward.
So now you have the community who begins to understand the depth of what is going on. How did the city begin to start responding to the community awareness and the reality of the leadership turmoil that you're describing?
I think one of the good things, when you think about how people began to feel differently about the city, and particularly in a positive way, I think you have to go back even further than 2008. I'd like to say it really started in the mid-90s. There was a first new mayor in 20 years. There was a sense of optimism. The city actually had a budget surplus, and the car companies were doing well, selling minivans. So there was some optimism. And the way that optimism began to percolate is there was an idea of attracting the Super Bowl to Detroit. And, after the giggles died down and we set about that, that was a real turning point, a real we can moment. It was a catalytic event. And some of the groundwork that was laid, some of the foundational transformational work that was set to go well beyond the game was what laid the foundation for today's revitalization. So brick and mortar changes began to happen. And when people who were naysayers or non-believers, when they saw brick and mortar change, they began to change as well.
So let's go back and talk for a minute about telling people why they should come to Detroit and the great experience they would have in Detroit. They were using the Super Bowl as the example, but what they were selling was the city.
That's right. The Super Bowl provided the city a unique spotlight. I think what began to happen then is the word began to get out that Detroit was a can-do place. The serious bootstrap mentality that began to change the city. So as we set about planning and pitching the NFL for the Super Bowl, keep in mind there was no Comerica Park, there was no Ford Field, Campus Marshes hadn't been built. The plan that we submitted called for half dozen hotels that didn't exist. So in order to get people's buy-in, we first had to sell the locals. We were our own worst critics. And then once, as locals, we began to feel differently about the city. We began to speak differently to our friends, family, and colleagues around the country and around the world.
So once we, as leaders, are able to overcome our own, this is really interesting, our own bias over why we can't succeed, right? Once we begin to overcome that, a lot of credit to those individuals, some of who I know, I'm sure most I don't know, but what was the next big thing that you saw that began the next step in the momentum?
I think the next step was once you raise expectations, you have to manage those expectations by delivering. And we had some major projects that had to be redone. There was the redo of the airport. You may remember the reconstruction of I-94. We had to deliver Ford Field, Comerica Park. Those things had to be built. So actually completing projects, making a difference in a visible way, and creating partnerships to make these things happen. So that's a critical part.
Yeah, no, this is just absolutely a fascinating walkthrough. So the first step being to kind of sell the vision and get to your own team to be believers.
Yeah.
And then the second step is you have to actually put into some sort of a visible way the things that you're selling. That was a big task then for you and your team.
It was. We had to literally rebuild our main street. Woodward was narrowed. We widened the sidewalks to allow for cafes and bistros. And these kinds of investments is exactly what created the vibrancy we see in Detroit today.
So the work you started to do 20 years ago was the beginning of laying the new foundation for now the vibrancy that we're experiencing today to start to exhibit
That's
itself.
Exactly correct.
So this is not a short game.
No, it's long ball for real. It's some really deep planning and thinking in unique ways about reinventing a place that everyone thinks they know. So imagine people are driving through the center of downtown at 50 miles an hour. How crazy that is. But when you think about narrowing the streets and widening the sidewalks, it creates opportunities for small businesses at the retail level. It creates interesting views for people who are above that in their offices. And it causes people to be re-engaged with the city in a very different way.
Who knew to do that 20 years ago when that wasn't a thing?
That's a good question. I would love to be able to take credit for that, but we have really good people in city planning, lent expertise. There were a lot of minds. Just before the Super Bowl came to Detroit, one of the first big projects was the redevelopment of the Weston Book Cadillac.
Right.
Major project. Next to the Book Cadillac, we built a garage, a parking garage. That garage was built with infrastructure for an apartment to be built on top of it. That garage was completed in 2006 and 2007. The apartment on top of it was completed last year.
10 years later.
10 years later. So the infrastructure that was in place not only saved the developer money, but that's the kind of planning you have to have in place in order to make things occur.
So if you're going to really and truly reinvent, I mean, you can use a disruption to make a quick left turn. Mm-hmm. But in reality, something as significant as a municipality takes a lot of deep thought and a lot of understanding of what the future trends will need to look like for a city 20 years into the future.
That's true. You really have to think honestly about yourself. You have to admit some hard truths. And I think part of the planning process did allow for Detroit to think about itself as not the Detroit of the past, but be a better Detroit tomorrow than we are today. At one point, Detroit had 1.8 million people. We're down to about 700,000. How do you make the city and its experience meaningful? And that's what the planning was about.
So the leadership that was doing this planning, and again, you used the example of the Super Bowl as a way in which we were able to sell something that didn't exist. Mm-hmm. But that became a really, really critical role because I think in almost every company we have this group of individuals who don't believe we can make the change.
That's true.
And in the city of Detroit, we had a whole group of people who didn't believe we could be a city of the future. Yeah. And yet the core group, whoever was involved as the core group of leaders who had to sustain this energy and just make it happen, even if it wasn't the popular vote at the time.
That's true. I think about it. When the CompuWare building, now called One Campus Martius, was built, people say, oh, one new office building won't matter. A ballpark won't matter. A football stadium won't matter. Casinos won't save the city. But all of these things taken together matter. They created jobs. They created 15 million visitors a year come to Detroit now. Connectivity is the key. It's connecting people to place. There are visual cues. There's connectivity in many different layers. The obvious one is like the queue line, but we don't often think about connectivity from a pedestrian point of view.
The Quinder Cut.
The Quinder Cut.
And apparently a couple of new ones going in that you're working on.
Yeah, we got brand new sidewalks all over everywhere. So if you're a cool kid who lives in Woodbridge and you want to go visit your hipster friends in Corktown, you can do that in dedicated space. So connecting these little pockets of vibrancy to one another to make a comprehensive and cohesive experience is an important thing. And we're being very successful at it right now.
So, Mark, the number one question that people always say, and I'm sure it was true in Detroit, we don't have the money for that.
Yeah, we didn't. But we got it.
We don't have the money for that. And then you came right back with, we got it.
There are lots of ways, there's money everywhere. You just got to go out and shake the trees.
So one of the things we've absolutely got to get away from is our more traditional way in which we look at how we are funded, how we get our revenue, mm-hmm. and really strategically think through how to, in your words, shake new trees, mm-hmm. find new partners, find new ways to do business to make these things happen. Because the old traditional way of waiting for the old city of Detroit to have the money to do this, well, we'd have still been waiting, right?
Think about our really great strategic partners, the philanthropic community, Hudson Weber, Kresge. Kresge did some wonderful philanthropic work in the city. What's really interesting in my work at the Economic Growth Corporation, we work with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. We will all invest in the same place. So our collaborative partners at the state, our philanthropic partners, our civic partners, nobody invests in an outpost. We invest together to create synergy and the greatest impact. And this is the hallmark of how Detroit is changing. And it's not limited to downtown either. You can see this all over the city, whether you're in the far west side, like Brightmoor, or East Inglis Village on the east side, Jefferson Chalmers, Livernois and 6 Mile. It's impact investing. Everyone is working together. That spirit of cooperation was really fostered through the partnerships that were forged as we worked to bring the Super Bowl to Detroit.
Let's go back to a municipality that's not in the Detroit metro area, where they're kind of now learning to feed off of each other, and right, we get this momentum. Let's take a business or a municipality that mm-hmm. that doesn't have that synergy going, but they want to.
It takes leadership, but you have to have common You have to establish common goals. And sometimes it's just based in concerns, addressing fears, addressing realities. And I think when people understand the circumstances that they're in, they'll want to work together to figure it out. Detroit, again, we had to do some really deep introspection to begin to change. You don't have that, you can't move forward.
Since you've been a kind of a career-long individual watching and being involved in this process, could you go back and start to make a list of the individuals that you watched change the conversation? Do you actually, can you actually put names of people to a list where you knew they were putting a great deal of energy into changing the conversation?
Sure.
And I'm not asking you to do that.
Oh, thank you, because I would leave somebody out, but
I think
have that
that
list.
if there's another municipality or another business who's saying, well, we can't do that, what you have to do, I think, is find that, and this goes back to the simplification that we want to focus on, is you have to have that list of people who are absolutely committed to changing that conversation and have them be a part of the, in the Detroit case, champion and sell the Super Bowl that doesn't exist yet, or whatever doesn't exist in your municipality or company that you're trying to change.
I don't often like to single out individuals, but I'll do this. I think Roger Penske was critical in changing the way people felt about this city. He wrote a personal check to pay for the Clean Downtown initiative and then encouraged all of his peers to invest in this initiative. When Detroit was dirty, all people saw was trash. But you clean up downtown, they see opportunity. Roger Penske championed that idea, and I thank him for it every time I see him. It's a wonderful thing. You help people see opportunity in a place where they didn't see it before.
So, Mark, about every 100 years, it seems as though Detroit kind of goes up and down, with the early 1900s being a major disruption in manufacturing and coming into the automobile industry, created great opportunity, but at the time was a big disruption. The bankruptcy, of course, was the second kind of big disruption that caused a lot of new thinking. How does a municipality or a business start to move away from the cyclic nature of a business, the business cycle, to a more sustainable long-term growth cycle?
In the case of City of Detroit, or even certain businesses, I think you have to look at the basic stuff. I like to look at the city as an ecosystem. And our ecosystem was built on the smallest things, the plankton, these small businesses, entrepreneurs, micro enterprises that reinvented first floor retail spaces, live work kind of spaces. They created an environment that was attractive to all the people who want to be near the cool kids, the IT firms, the design firms, the engineering firms, the architects. Those are the fish. And then once the fish are in place, what happens? The services that these micro businesses and these small entrepreneurs offer become in greater demand. That cycle begins to repeat. Now the fish are in place and they're strong. What happens? We begin to attract the whales and the sharks, Quicken Loans and other large companies. And now as downtown becomes popular, in demand, expensive, and competitive, that ecosystem begins to replicate itself in other parts of the city. And that's why we're going to be sustainable. In addition to that kind of sustainability, long-term planning, we went through a very detailed planning process with Detroit Future City that was divided into a 10-year chunk and a 50-year chunk. So people who are thinking about investing can see their investment in the context of time.
Mark, in order to bring this leadership to Detroit, you yourself have to stay very informed. What do you do to invest in your own understanding?
Constant reading, keeping myself educated as a professional, but also staying closely connected to the people that we are trying to help. You know, this work is not about me. It's about creating jobs, tax base, and opportunity for people of the city of Detroit. I very rarely drive. I walk all the neighborhoods. You can't understand or see it at 35 or 50 miles an hour. So you have to walk it. You have to be connected to the place. So I walk and I talk to people. I slow down and understand how the work is affecting them.
And that is pure reinvention. Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anita, so many takeaways with the Mark Denson interview. What's at least one big one for you that really struck home?
History. Mark really spent a lot of time explaining the importance of understanding the history and the evolution of the Economic Growth Corporation in Detroit and the evolution of the mayors, that is essential to a long-term success for Detroit.
So from a leadership perspective, one can't truly lead until you are removing one big barrier, which is do not repeat the mistakes of the past. So in order to not repeat those mistakes, you have to know what the history is.
Yes, it is not repeating, or if you do, you limit what you're repeating to make sure that it doesn't have the same long-term impact that the ones previously did.
Yeah, so for a leader to really be able to build their messaging into a story, naturally pulls people in. And to me, the pulling people naturally in also takes into account, Anita, one thing that I want to ask you about, and that's Mark talked about being naturally impatient.
Mm-hmm.
By pulling people into the story, does that help with people's impatience because they begin to understand where the business is going and what perhaps their role is?
And it also shows how much time it took to go from one step to the next. And while you're trying to dig out that belief system and the belief that people have hidden, that hope factor. And Mark was talking about the essence of having to dig out the hope factor and getting people to believe. But along with believing is making sure that they do have the patience that's necessary to see this change evolve. Because the things that he referenced in Detroit and all the things that occurred, they're not overnight objectives or they're not overnight plans that they can get done while someone's sleeping. I mean, you're talking about multi-year projects.
So let's talk about, with people being naturally impatient for a lot of the change that needs to take place in an environment, one of the things that I heard that I was really intrigued by was Mark talking about the can-do attitude and how they were able to use the Super Bowl as kind of the launch for, well, what is still projects that are being kicked off right now, which track back to that first big one, which started to give people that hope and that new story, which was bringing the Super Bowl to Detroit. So talk about that being the launch for the can-do place. So
when Mark referenced the can-do, Detroit being the can-do city, he referenced a lot about those people, kind of the giggles, and when those simmer down. It's the, I'm not sure that can really take place, and who's going to want to do that, and who's going to want to go there, and showing them that we can do this. This is possible. And then taking that one step to the next step and saying, okay, we did step number 1. Now we can do step 2 and 3, which is even going to be bigger than step 1.
So let's give that an example. So in step 1 being we were able to pull off a very successful Super Bowl in spite of it being Detroit and January and all the perhaps perceived negativity. A successful Super Bowl launched us into a redo
94.
of 94, which is an important artery into the city from the airport, which was another big project that happened post Super Bowl, right? And so all of these things start to line up, right? They all start to add together. But it became an example that showed people it wasn't just one project we could do. Our attitude was to do continuous projects. And that's what really started to capture people's awareness, wasn't it?
Then they started to believe. If you don't have a strong belief system and the genuine hope of people, they'll be lost from step 1. There is no support for you to continue on with your success, and they would have abandoned the whole plan from probably step 2.
So people intuitively know whether this is a one-trick pony or whether you are in it for the long haul and you, as a leader, are capable of adding projects together to make a real difference.
Yes, and that leader takes on all that responsibility while they're trying to get people to bring out that hope, digging out that hope that was lost so long ago.
If you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it pure reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.